Welcome and thank you everybody for joining our Sargassum webinar series. We are launching this series to raise awareness about key issues surrounding sargassum. Each webinar will highlight different aspects of sargassum research, management, and its impacts on coastal communities and ecosystems, as pictured here in this graphic. The goal of this series is to foster knowledge sharing and regional collaboration across affected areas as we continue to see the impacts from sargassum inundation events. My name is Catherine Egan. I'm the Southeast and Caribbean Regional Coordinator for NOAA based in Key West, Florida, and one of the hosts of this webinar series. I help co-lead and coordinate for NOAA's Southeast and Caribbean Regional Collaboration Team, also known as SECART. SECART is one of 8 regional collaboration teams across the country, working with both NOAA staff and partners throughout the U.S. to foster stronger collaborative ties in an effort to improve NOAA's regional capabilities and services. You can find more information on SECART by following the link that we'll put in the chat in just a moment. Here are the webinars that are taking place during this series. Today is our 4th webinar out of 5. You can scan the QR code at the top of this slide, and that will take you to the website where you can view descriptions of each webinar and then also register for our 5th webinar, which will be taking place next week. We'll also put a link to that website in the chat as well. With me today are my co-hosts Max Brown and Josie Galloway with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS. And I'll pass it over to Max to introduce himself.
Hey, thank you, Catherine. My name is Max. I'm a contractor working at NCOS as a program analyst, and I have a background in coastal ecology and phytoplankton, among other things. I've been working on issues surrounding sargassum management from the federal level for about a year and a half, working on some different papers and helping out with some workshops. And with me is Josie Galloway.
Hi everyone, I'm Josie and I also work at NOAA and COS. I am an executive secretary for the Interagency Working Group on Harmful Algal Blooms and Hypoxia Research and Control Act. That group sits under the National Science and Technology Council. In my role, I help to coordinate the federal agencies to develop strategies to research, prevent, control, and mitigate the impacts of HABs, which include sargassum. And I've helped Catherine and Max over the past year to organize a couple of different analyses and workshop events. If you could go to the next slide, thank you. I'm going to go over some housekeeping items before we get started. First, all participants will be muted during the presentation, but you can send your questions to us in the chat box, and we will answer them at the end. Second, due to a large number of participants, some of the slides might be slightly delayed. And finally, we will be recording this webinar, and we will put the link to watch on our website after this series ends. With that, I'll pass it back to Catherine to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Josie. All right, let's go ahead and pass screen sharing permissions off to Amy. And while Amy is getting all situated, I will go ahead and introduce her to our audience today. So we're pleased to welcome Amy Dempsey. She's going to be presenting on methods currently being used to address sargassum inundations in the U.S. Virgin Islands, issues, successes, and failures. Ms. Dempsey founded BioImpact Inc. in 1986 and has been doing environmental consulting since that time. Trained as a marine biologist, Ms. Dempsey came to St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands, as an aquanaut for NOAA's undersea habitat. She has been working with resorts to address the sargassum issue over the last 5 years and helped produce the Sargassum Blueprint for the U.S. Virgin Islands Department of Planning and Natural Resources. Amy, thank you so much for being here today. Just want to let you know we can see your presentation, but you do need to make it in full screen mode. There we go. Now it's in full screen mode.
Yeah, I am so glad, because I just want to tell everybody that has been a challenge. We've been playing with this for the last little bit, trying to make it work right. So I am very happy that you guys can see my screen well. So as she was saying, my name is Amy Dempsey, and I'm with BioImpact, and I've been doing this for quite a while, and I have been fully engaged with sargassum for about the last 5 years. And so what I want to talk about today is some of the methods that we're currently using to address the inundations in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the issues we had, the successes we've had, and the failures, and basically the things we're learning as we go through and are learning about this, because I have to say, it doesn't go by a day that we don't find out something new and figure out a better way to address it. Now, I think that one of the things that we all are aware of, especially those of us on the call, that sargassum is now going to be something, it's not like, oh my gosh, this happened, it's a one-time event. This is something we're going to be dealing with for years and years to come. This is probably going to become a normal part of our lives in the Caribbean, in Florida, and it has a significant impact on tourism, fisheries, and on the general public and people who live along the shoreline or like to go to the shoreline to enjoy it. And it has health effects. It takes away enjoyment of our outdoor resources. So this is something that is very important that we need to find ways to address. And something I really want to stress here is that, we've been able to do what we're doing and help some, resorts and people with funds and people that this is economically affected. So they are able to fund doing some of this research, to fund doing these methods and reaching out and trying to stem this coming ashore. But this is something we eventually need to get so we can do this for areas that are natural resources, areas that are used by the public, because it should not just be, there needs to be funding somehow, as I'm saying this in the world of lower amounts of funding available out there, but it's something that needs more research. It's something that we need to come up with better methods to address. So I'm very excited about this series, and I'm very happy to share what we've learned and what we've figured out as a way to help deal with this. Now, as I said, I've been working with sargassum for about the last, I guess it's 5 years, going almost 6 now. My very first engagement with it on how to control it was back in around 2019, and I was asked to help develop a plan to potentially collect sargassum offshore and also to divert it. And this was primarily related to the Ritz-Carlton in St. Thomas, and it was like, okay, it's having a significant impact on their resort, and what can we do to make it better? And I was also that same year asked to do a benthic study of some barriers that had been deployed, and they had been deployed without permits, and what kind of impact those barriers had had, and then to go through the process of permitting them. And then as I started working on those, and I was working on methods to lay out barriers in different areas and how to position them, then by July 2021, we asked for our first trial of the barriers out at Ritz-Carlton. And then very shortly thereafter, we asked for a trial at Sapphire Bay Marina. Now, the reason we asked for trials rather than going out and asking for permits was we weren't sure what was going to work. We weren't sure how we wanted to position them, what was going to be the best way to keep it from coming to shore, and how we were going to be able to direct it to one area. That way it could be cleaned up. And that's something I want to really stress right now, is that's, as we are going to be talking about the barriers and things we put out, these have been very specific. We've made sure that we're not diverting sargassum onto someone else, and I think that's something very, very important. You can't take your problem and just put it onto somebody else. This has got to be something that we've made sure it goes on to the property, and then that is cleaned up there, and it does not affect another property. And we were lucky enough to be able to work with DPNR in 2023 and developed a foundational blueprint for the development of a comprehensive pelagic sargassum management plan for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And that was it is something that's available on DPNR's website, and I have the website link here for if anybody wants to go and look at it. And it was a collaborative effort of everyone in BioImpact, myself, Lee Fletcher, Jonna Neeson-Bobbitt, and Ann Tagini, who we worked at collecting a lot of the data we had. We did shareholder interviews. And the document basically is a literature review of sargassum plans and modeling from all over the Caribbean, because this isn't something that's just impacting us. It's impacting everybody in the Caribbean, Mexico. And so there is a wealth of knowledge out there. We looked at the overview as what was the current regulatory regulations back in 2023. There's been more movement towards developing and trying to see what's impacting. I mean, like this webinar series we're doing right now with NOAA. We looked at what was required to be able to clean up sargassum, what was required to be able to put out booms. We looked and saw what were the hot spots that were being affected in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And as we found, which is the case both in St. Croix and St. Thomas and St. John, it's the eastern end of the islands that are really impacted. And some of the places that are impacted the worst are those very deep facing, eastern facing bays, because the sargassum goes in and it's very difficult for it, once it accumulates, for it being able to get back out. And we worked on, and that plan presents our recommendations for creating a local sargassum working group. And then something I think is very important, because one of the things I truly believe is, there's a lot of methods and people are looking at on how to address the sargassum and how we deal with it. But it's very important that we permit these actions and that we ask for permission of these actions. And one of the things in this document is we did a first draft of a regional general permit for sargassum. It basically provides a framework through which actions can be taken to address the sargassum inundations, because sargassum has a lot of impact on the environment. Once it builds up on the shoreline, it literally devastates the nearshore resources. But when we do something to try to prevent this from happening, it's very important that we make sure our actions don't add more injury to the environment, that they don't actually cause more impact or different impact. So it really helps to go through a permit process, to actually be looking at the habitat you're putting it into and getting as many eyes on it as possible. Now, we've been really lucky because, and what I'm going to talk about today is that in the last 5 years, we've got to work in some very different habitats, some very different marine situations. We've been able to work in a very nice, calm, sandy bay, and we've been able to work in a very exposed rock bottom situation. And they have very different methods of installation and different challenges in each situation. And we've also gotten to work with different barrier types. We're working with some curtains now, as you can see in the picture in your top right corner, that a young man is taking one of the barriers out, walking out to put it off the end as we're deploying them. And he can wade, he can ride on a paddleboard. It's not a high-tech or really difficult situation to do this. And down bottom, you see a different layout of barriers. And these are very heavy duty. They have metal cables. We had to crimp things to get them together. And it was, very different types of insulation. You can see the barriers look very different and the layouts are very different. So we've been lucky enough to try these things and see what works, and different things work in different environments. Now, we were really lucky because we were able to the very first thing we started was in a calmer bay with a sand bottom. And as I said, it was very important for us to make sure that we were going to direct the sargassum, which we were basically collecting and stopping, onto the property that was belonged to whose property we were protecting. That way we weren't going to impact the next door neighbors. We weren't going to impact a public beach. And also we were trying to minimize impact on shoreline access. And, these were all things we were looking at as we started the trial with the barriers. Now, very early on, I was asked to help work with a gentleman who was trying to come up with a way that he thought, this is great, we're going to put the barriers out, but let's try to collect the sargassum behind them. And it's a great idea and concept, and I know, there's some great things going on. SOS Carbon has created a net mechanism and can collect it using local fishermen. And there's a lot of ways that we can do this. And you can see he came up with this great idea, with these cages on either, and he actually first had cages on one side and then decided, to put cages on both sides. And it's very clunky, to say it a nice way, and it was awkward in waves. So this was actually not a bad place to try it. But one of the things we very quickly found is, and his idea was to collect it, then to take it offshore far enough where you could release it and it would not go back onto a beach, and it would not end up, impacting somebody else. And it would, this would be a great idea because, of course, the animals in it or anything else would be collected and carried offshore and then released where they continue being offshore. But what we found very quickly is that it did not pick, for the amount coming in, it was not making a significant difference. It was not enough to make, so much was still going ashore, you really could not tell the difference from doing this. And also part of that was because, you could only pick up so much with this. And it took a very long time to go all the way out far enough where you could release it and get back. So this was not a very good idea. It was a good idea in principle, but it did not work well as far as practice. So we go back and we're like, okay, how do we lay out these barriers? Because we weren't sure how the sargassum would move along the barriers. We weren't sure, how it was going to be affected. Is it going to just build up behind the barriers and sink? And so we started looking at what the currents were like and where we were looking to put them in. And of course, as always goes with science, when we start doing our research, there's like very little sargassum, and we're following it, and we tried to do as much as we could, but we also found that we really needed some references. So we created some little drogues out of oranges, and we found that if we put little pennant flags on them, they moved just like the sargassum. So it was really nice because sargassum is impacted when it's going along not only by the currents and waves, because it's in the water, but because it's on the surface and the leaves are reaching up, that in a lot of ways it has sail. So it's being affected by the currents, the waves, and by the wind. And so we were trying to say, okay, which is, what is the best angle for us to put the barriers? We were very concerned about that because we wanted to make sure it moved along and we wouldn't have problems. But little did we know, it really didn't make a lot of difference. So this was our first deployment, and this was at in Great Bay, and we received these and worked with some people that do these barriers, and the gentleman came down and helped put these barriers out. And as you can see, these are very industrial, for lack of another word, very heavy duty. They've got the hard black plastic, a piece that stands up, and then the orange floats on the side of the barrier itself. And then you can see it's got two pendant buoys out on either side. And this is, I don't know if any of you do port work or, are around like where there's big industrial type boating things, is that this is very similar to the oil, so to some of the oil booms and containment booms that you see out there. And this is how they develop these, because this is a floating, problem. I mean, this is much like what you do when you find oil. And so what you have in this situation is that you have metal cable going from the barriers to each of the orange floats, and then from the orange floats down to the seafloor. And it kind of looks like stitches, for lack of a better way to describe it. And this kind of gives you a picture of, you can see the sargassum is just building up on the side of it. And when we did this first deployment, and we got it out there, and we found very quickly that the sargassum moves along the barrier, as long as you can see in the picture on the left, you can actually see the angle of the waves coming along. So it was able just to push the sargassum right on along it. But something that we were seeing is that some of it was getting caught up on the pennant buoys that are off to the side. And so there were some challenges that we thought, or we faced as we were looking at these, is that, first of all, the metal cables, as you can see them here, weren't easy to work with. These were, they're very stiff. We had to loop up some of the cables, because the water was shallower, and it was not easy to get, to manipulate them. And when we put the screw anchors in, and you can see we've got on the upper right hand side, you can see the cable hooked to a screw anchor there. And with the angle, you can see that the cable is right, above the seagrass. And with waves, we don't have a lot of tidal range in the Virgin Islands, only about 0.8 of a foot. So we're not getting a lot of tidal range on a normal daily basis. But we found that these cables were bouncing on the bottom, and over time we were seeing that they were actually hurting the seagrass beds. And as we were putting these out, we ran out of cables in the last barrier we went to put out, and we just happened to have some floating line that we usually use on our boat. And so instead of using the cable, we took the floating line, it's a rope that floats, and we tied off the curtain and tied it to our screw anchor. And over the course of our trial, when we had this out, we found that there was no difference between how the barriers were reacting, that we tied with the floating line without the pennant buoys, and without the big heavy cables, and with only one screw anchor, the barrier was staying right in the same place. And here's a picture to kind of show you what the difference was. If you look on the right, on the left, you can see where the cable had bounced on the bottom. You can see where there's the seagrass is worn, whereas when we had the floating line, there was no damage to the seagrass whatsoever. So it's like, okay, it's better for the seagrass beds if we go to the floating line. So when we did our second deployment, we went to a different barrier, because one of the things is the other one did look very industrial, and this blue barrier is less visible. We do put out things that say, hey, there's something here, that way boats can see it. But we felt this was a more attractive barrier for resorts to use. And so this is what we went with on the second time we did the second trial. And we did not use the pennant buoys in this time. We just went straight from a single line of sand screws, a single line of screw anchors. And we put them, one line on the upland side and just tied the barriers with floated line. And as you can see, we're able to get a very straight line here. And that is what we're still using now at this site. And so it worked really, really well. And as you see in this picture, you see how beautiful and straight this was. And that was something we were so concerned about at first. We were so afraid that if the curtains weren't totally tight and totally aligned, that the sargassum would build up and not move along, which of course it wasn't quite that bad at all. They can have gaps and bows, and the sargassum will still move along them. Not gaps, it's just bows. They can still move around. They can be have little dips in them, and it doesn't make an impact. So why did this deployment method work in Great Bay? And it's because what we find here is, it's a very deep bay. It's a deep embayment. It does not have a lot of wave action. The waves, we're able just to put out things on one side because the waves are always coming from one direction. We don't have to worry about the curtains being pulled across the lines and going the other way. It's only, they're always coming from the same way. So that's not a concern for us. And that really helped make a difference. And something I know, which is very obvious in this picture, is we found very quickly, one, you can't take the barriers all the way to shore. They've got a skirt on them. And even if you took the floating barrier all the way to shore, it's still and didn't have a skirt on it, it bounces up and down and things can get under it. So we very quickly found that we needed something, which I'll talk about in a second, that we call a catch barrier. And so what we learned, and as you can see now in the picture, and this picture's from, I guess, about 2 weeks ago, and is that the barriers don't have to be in a tight straight line. The sargassum will move along them with the current. That one of the things that we find out is when it's choppy or you've got a really strong wind, the sargassum is not all of it, but small amounts are going to get tossed over, and you're not going to be able to keep it all off the beach. It's just, there's nothing you can do about it, especially when it gets real choppy. Pieces of sargassum get thrown over. So, it's not perfect, and especially like the last couple of weeks where we've gotten such an inundation, they can't stop everything. And we found also is if it builds up behind, as you're getting close to, it gets near the shore and it's getting hung up behind the catch barrier, is it builds up, it will go under the barrier. And the longer it sits in the water, it will start sinking, and you will have, some of it escape through the bottom. And you have to have the catch barrier, because if you don't, it will just go around the end and end up spreading back along your entire beach. And one of the other things we found, because, you need boat access sometimes to the beach, you need to the shoreline, to a dock. And we found out that you have to really put a pretty huge overlap when you have an opening, because it will tend to go around the end of the curtain and trail a little bit and then head on back to shore. So, we have, as shown here, we have 100-foot overlap, and that seems to work really well. But that's what it takes, because, we've tried in the past having like a 20-foot overlap. That didn't work. We went up to 40 foot, and then we said, okay, let's just go to 100. But this worked super well. And what happens here is the sargassum moves along the outer barrier, and then as it reaches the end, it basically cascades over and then continues down. Now, when boats come around, they do sometimes drag sargassum with them, but it's not as bad as it could be, and you only end up with a small amount of going to shore. So as I was talking about the catch barriers, is when we were doing the first trial, as you can see here, we were doing a great job. The sargassum's coming right along the curtains, and then the minute it gets to the end, going right at the shore. And as you can see in this photo, it spread right back along the shore. And, it was like, yeah, this is great, but only the very end of the beach really ended up with a lot of benefit from this. And so that's when we decided we need to look at a way to keep it on the shoreline and get it into a single location. And what we did was figure out how to build catch barriers. And, because you can't get the curtains all the way to the shore, the sargassum will go under the curtains as it builds up. And once it starts building up, if you don't have something pretty substantial, the waves are just going to throw it over, even in the calmest environment. Now, we're like, okay, let's build catch barriers. And the very first catch barriers, we built them out of these nice little PVC frames, and we thought this is going to work great. Well, we found very quickly that sargassum, as it starts building up, has a lot of weight. And we finally ended up going with some light metal frames and using with a very heavy mesh, because we found that was necessary, and then put our screen over it. And, it works really well. You can see in this photograph, you can see, just a little bit of detritus on the shoreline, but you can see the sargassum on the other side of the barrier. But we have found these days that with the kind of inundations we've gotten, especially this year, we've gone to using I-beams, and these very heavy metal frames seem to be doing the trick now, because the lighter metal frames, when it got as heavy as it's been this year, were not able to withstand the sargassum coming in. So what we found is that you have to extend the catch barrier out to a depth between 2.5 and 3 feet of water depth. You've got to get, them out pretty far. Otherwise, once the barriers start dragging the bottom, it doesn't do well, and it causes more damage to the seafloor. And you have to have the barriers come all the way up beyond the highest wave run up, because otherwise the sargassum gets carried up all the way to the top of the barrier, goes around, and ends up spreading back down the beach. And most important, these things have to be braced and weighted enough that they can withstand the buildup of the sargassum. So we're slammed this week, and these pictures are from a couple of days ago. And we, as you can see, the tourists are playing in the water, and the sargassum is all behind the barrier. Now, when we first got inundated earlier in the week, we had it getting under the curtain and some of it going over. And one of the things we had been working with NOAA and talking about, how do you collect this stuff offshore? How can we minimize impact? What can we do here? Is that using traditional fishing methods is one way to pick it up. And here we have 2 young ladies out there in waders, and they're basically picking this up with some fish trap wire and netting, and they're bringing it ashore, or it can be cleaned up. But it's this inundation, this year is by far been one of the worst years we've had. And again, like I said, I think this barriers work. I mean, there's no doubt that they do. And I think this is really shows you that, they are a good method to protect the shoreline and the beach from being inundated. Now, like I was saying, Rick's was a great idea, Great Bay. We have a nice sand bottom, easy to put in screw anchors. It's not rough. And then we go over around the corner to Red Bay, where you have it's exposed, it gets significant wave action, and the seafloor is made of rock and pavement. The like the rock pavement, the coral pavement, however you prefer to call it. It is an entire different type of insulation. And as you can see here in the picture you can see here's the barrier again, and it is shedding the the sargassum off, and the sargassum is going onto the shoreline where they will pick it up, and it does not leave the bay, and it's not going downstream onto anyone else. And as I said, when I very first, this is back in 2019, I was asked to go out and look at some barriers that were put out. And what had happened is they had used Dampered anchors, just small dampered anchors, and they had anchored this as if they were anchored on a boat. And as you can see, this is a pavement bottom with what is a sand veneer, a couple of inches of sand on it, and they had laid these anchors there with the chain. And the problem was, because there really was no sand for the anchors to dig into, that the anchors, and then in another case, they hooked one of the chains up to a small concrete buoy. And as you can see here, the barriers have a lot of sail. There's enough sticking out of the water. They're getting a lot of wind action. They're being moved around by the waves, and there's a lot of current. And then you start getting sargassum behind them. It's a lot of pressure, and small anchors will not work. It's just, the small, without being able to dig in, these anchors were dragging on the bottom. They were causing damage to corals. And, and in this case, you can see they're lifting the concrete block off the ground. And so, it was a real challenge. How do we address in a situation where you have a lot more wind, a lot more wave? You've got to have anchors that are heavy enough to withstand the waves. And where we're going to, and in the process of working on getting a permit for now, is actually we're going to put in rock pins. That's the best way to go. We're going to go out, drill holes in the bottom, and put in permanent epoxy rock pins, and that way you don't ever have a problem. Because one of the things we found is that when we were going through the trials is we made some 250-pound blocks, and very quickly found that in the wave situation, and when you start getting a lot of sargassum buildup, or when it's really rough, even the blocks could move. So what we ended up doing in a lot of cases was putting down 2 blocks. So you're now looking at close to 500 pounds, and in that case, it wasn't moving. Now, this is a different situation, whereas over in Great Bay, it's not that rough. And we were able to put out the barriers with just ropes straight from the screw anchor up to the barriers. There's not a lot of pull, there's not a lot of bouncing. But in this situation, we found that it's much rougher. And so you're getting that constant pull, and it's starting to damage the barriers. It's putting a lot of strain on the ropes. And so here we went back to putting in pennant buoys. The line goes from the anchor up to the floating buoy, in this case, the little orange ones, and then the line then goes from the pennant buoy to the barrier. And so this is, we're going back to what the manufacturer had those, but in this case, we only need them on one side because, again, continual current from one direction, and it's not a problem. So again, we were able to get the barriers out here, and they were able to be able to direct the sargassum and keep it around where we were trying to keep it out of the mouth of a marina. Now, one of the things that was very difficult here is because there are corals. This is a hard bottom habitat. You've got critical habitat. So, this is something we were really looking at, okay, how do we address this? And it took a lot of, positioning, mapping corals, finding out exactly where everything is. That way it would minimize the impact. And as you can see here, you can see the buoys sat up current from the barrier, and you can almost see where the ropes are going across. And the little schematic that's over on, now I'm saying right side because it's the right side of what I'm looking at, and I'm assuming, yes, it's the right side of what you're looking at as well. But it gives you an idea on how this lays out. Now, we do not have the rock pens in there yet. That is something we're hoping to be able to do this year. And we have gotten, we're able to find places where it was not critical habitat, where it was consolidated hard bottom, to place anchors, so we can, have minimal damage to the environment. And this is just, it's a lot of work when you are putting these anchors, and this is all done. It's all done, with divers. And here, this is like a 300-pound, concrete anchor. It's one of the sizes that we were using when we were first doing some of these trials. And as you can see here, they got the lift bag tank, and they're carrying it, because it is one of the nice things when you're working underwater, is that it makes you, it's really cool to pick up something huge and be able to walk around with it on the bottom. Now, as I was saying, one of the things that gets very difficult when you get into an environment that has corals and coral resources is that you really have to figure out, okay, how do we keep our lines away from corals? How do we make sure we're not going to have impact? Which gets right back to why it is important to get permits. But this is one of the ideas that we've been working with, and is working very well, is in areas where you've got hard bottom, use rock pens, and put them where possible in sand pockets and grottos, and you put them in the middle of a sand patch, and then you, in this case, we'll probably use double double sand spruce, and go to pennants on either side. And the reason for that is by having the two pennants, we're able to keep the barrier from dragging, or the line from dragging too far over. And also, we would put midline floats that would keep the floating lines, which we are still using floating lines instead of going to the heavy metal cables. The floated lines are so much easier to work with as a diver, and it's simple. I mean, you can tie knots, and it works just, it's a much simpler application than trying to work with the cables, especially in an environment like this where there are seas, and it's an easy way to do it. But by looking at what the environment is, we can come up with ways to address it. Now, one of the things that is an issue that I wanted to bring up is that there is bycatch when you collect sargassum. And we're finding in the sargassum on the shoreline, we're finding small lobster. Last week, very first time ever, on the shore, we found a sargassum frogfish. It's something, we all hope we wouldn't see. And, we want to believe, okay, these animals are vacating the sargassum before it comes ashore, but they aren't. And then I wanted to show, this is a picture that was taken several years ago in St. John, and this is from our sargassum. It's in our sargassum blueprint, and we quote the source in there. I'm sorry, I probably should have here, but there are baby sea turtles in it. And so there are animals in this that are getting to the shoreline, and this is something to keep in mind. And and another reason why it's good to go through and get your permitting. One of the things, Fish and Wildlife, local Fish and Wildlife comes out and gives training to people who are going to be collecting the sargassum on the shoreline, and tell you what to do if these things occur. And one of the things we found during the working on the blueprint, as we interviewed people, people who were collecting, oh, we never see turtles, we never see turtles. And we know why they're saying that, because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. Because then you talk to people who don't realize, that there's an issue, and you talk to tourists, oh, it's so cool, I saw this turtle they picked up, and you're like, okay. But it's one of the things why it's so important that we get information out. And one of the things which I think we really need to do as a territory is get a take permit for some of these species. That way, we can come up with better methods to protect them. Now, something that's very super important that I want to touch on here is that you put these things out and they take a lot of work. As you can see on the left-hand side, the birds are like these things a lot. You can see the bird that's all the way on the right-hand side is standing on a deflated barrier. The styrofoam within the barrier has gotten saturated, the barrier is sinking, and as you can imagine, what's happening now is that it's not, it starts coming over all the time. On the picture on the right here, one edge of the barrier has torn off. And so this is something, you have to periodically go and check everything. You've got to check your lines. You can see how it tears. We came up with an interim measure on how to stop it to come through when it got really bad, and, of ways to, try to keep them functioning. These barriers are not cheap. They're paying, a nice amount of money for them. And then the maintenance is something else. Now, and then, you also have to go and dive and snorkel them, because the ties erode under between them. And before you know it, you've got a gap in your barriers, and the sargassum is going to come right under it. And as you can see here, you can see the hanging shackles on the right, is that the ropes come untied from one side of it, and it's torn the curtain. And so, these are things that require constant maintenance and coming back and looking for. And a super important part is you have to have inclement weather plans, and you've got to implement them, and implement them early. Unfortunately, the sargassum and hurricane season and rough weather overlap. And when storms are coming, you've got to get the barriers out of the water, because if you don't, they can cause damage to the environment, and you can have your curtains shredded. And again, this is why, working with agencies, getting your permits is super important, because, they require these things. They require you to have, an inclement weather plan, a hurricane plan, and require you to take the barriers out of the water before storms happen. And there are so much other issues, which I know, we'll get into later as over time, as we look more into this. Sargassum cleanup has terrible impacts on beaches. Sand is picked up if you use heavy equipment. We're going much more to picking it up with pitchforks and throwing it into buckets. That way you don't pick up all the sand. But, this comes to the cost of resorts. We're having to buy more sand as we're throwing sand away into the landfill, because that's where all the sargassum is going for us right now. So, as I said, the barriers do work, and we've been really lucky to get to work on this and learn so much. And I hope you've learned something from this, and I will be glad to answer any questions anybody has. And if we don't have time to answer them today, I'll be glad to email you an answer later.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was a fantastic presentation. So interesting to see what kind of methods you use. We really appreciate you also sharing the failures, and we hope that folks are able to learn a little bit from you today, rather than going out and duplicating efforts. We had a lot of questions come in. Let me see here. I'm happy to start it, Josie and Max, and then maybe I'll pass it off to Josie next. So one of the questions that we had come in, this is a twofold question for you, Amy. when you were referring to your vessels, how many collection vessels would it have taken to actually make an impact? And then there was a follow-up question, maybe a larger vessel could have been more effective?
Yeah, it would have taken, okay, I have to tell you, you would have needed a fleet of vessels for what we're getting just right now. But I do think if you got a large enough vessel offshore to collect and like took it up onto a barge where you could be constantly, collecting it, um, it's not a bad idea. And I've seen, everybody's doing these, different things to look at, but it's a lot. And it comes in clumps, and it's going to be hard to collect it offshore. But I think that's eventually that's where I think we're going to need to go to try to keep it offshore. But collecting it out the barriers, you would need 4 or 5 vessels just going constantly, picking up. And I think not every day that's the same. Some days you could probably do it with 2, but there would have been no way you could have kept up with what we had this last week.
Thank you. I'll pass it back to Josie.
Thanks, Catherine. I am going to choose a question that I was also kind of interested in the answer, so I'm a little bit selfish in my question choosing. But one of the audience members asks, does the boom placement assume fairly consistent trade winds? And were there situations where you had to deal with wind reversals or countercurrents?
We were blessed. We were absolutely blessed. I mean, we consistently have that easterly wind. Or like with let's say in Great Bay, we're really, let's say it suddenly blows from the west or something. Because of the situation of the bay, it really had no impact on the barriers, and it blew the sargassum out of the bay anyway. But over on Red Bay, when we ended up with a westerly wind, the barriers did not help at all. It did not, they actually, if anything, they made it worse because it directed it where we didn't want it to go. But yes, the layouts we have a consistent wind. I mean, ours is either southeast, east, or northeast. And so we're, or it's a storm. And then that's a whole nother situation.
Thank you. All right. Max, do you want to ask a question from our list?
Sure, yeah. There's a question here, I guess about, once sargassum is captured, or I guess trapped, kind of what happens to it then? Then what? Does it get disposed of or collected, or where does it kind of go?
Yeah. Therein lies our problem. And I'm going to say this, and I mean it. The day we monetize it and we can make it a valuable resource, we will see so much technology come out to collect this stuff and get it cleaned up. But no, right now for us in the Virgin Islands, one of the things we looked at in our sargassum blueprint is, a lot of people go, oh, it's good, great for fertilizer, whatever. But one of the things they found, and you can look at the research and some of the peer-reviewed articles, is that there are heavy metals, there's toxins. This stuff makes great oil absorbent. So a lot of times there's hydrocarbons in it. And unfortunately, we pick it up, we put it in dumpsters, and we carry it to the landfill. And, one of the things that was very sad to see is, I could look in the St. Croix landfill pictures on Google Earth, and you're watching, you see when it's first there, it's nice, this nice dark piles of sargassum. And then you look over time, suddenly there's these nice, beautiful white piles, and it's sand, because the sargassum's rotted out, and it's just showing you how much sand we're collecting. But we are throwing it away in the landfill, and it's a problem because some days they have to shut down allowing it to come in. And the collection, and for those of you that have been around it, it smells terrible. I mean, so when you're collecting it, the dumpster, the area of collection, as it starts decomposing, it is pretty horrific.
Thanks, Amy. We're actually getting a lot of questions from folks about what happens with the sargassum once removed. So I think you went ahead and answered a lot of those there with that.
Yeah,
So thank
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. One of the things I wanted to do is that one of the things that was really cool was people are looking at things to do with it, making bricks, making a plastic. Somebody at one point in time sent me, an article that they were trying to make a material and they were going to make sweaters out of it. And I volunteered, please send me a sweater. I'll wear it and see, and see how it goes, as long as it doesn't smell like sargassum. But yeah, we've got to find a way to do something with it, and that is, hey, maybe it is a good absorbent. Maybe we take it and we use it in booms to clean up oil. But we need to find a good use for it, so we're not just filling up our landfill.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, actually, that's a really good plug for our webinar next week. That'll be the last one in this series. We have some folks coming in mostly to talk about like biofuels as it relates to sargassum. So I'll drop the link to that here in the chat if folks want to register for next week. But I did want to, this question just came in, Amy, and I'm actually very curious to know as well. Approximately how much sargassum have you collected this year from the USVI?
I wish I could answer that question. All I can say, it has really been pretty horrific. I mean, this year, what's going on now is just overwhelming. It really is. And I know that they were literally filling up bins the big, 40-yard bins as fast as they could go and taking them to the landfill. They had them stacked and they were just going and going. So I imagine that is a good question. And I have to tell you, I'll see if I can find that out. If we can say it in next week's seminar. That way, that would be a cool thing to have.
Yeah, let us know and we'll go ahead and make an announcement. I think that'd be a pretty cool metric as well. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Josie to ask another question.
Yes, let's see. I was wondering, did you investigate to see if decreased wave action caused from the barriers led to increased temperatures towards the beach or any other impacts to the beach from decreased wave action?
This time of the year the water is pretty warm and it gets warmer as it goes, and no, we have not looked at that, but that is a good thing to look at. But one of the things we absolutely notice is it's causing beach accretion because we're dampening the wave action offshore, and so since it's slowing down the waves, it's causing them not to lose as much sand. But because of course, there's still, once we got the barriers up, they stopped losing sand because they weren't having to groom the whole, rake the entire beach for sargassum. But we're finding that because it dampens the waves coming in, that you're actually getting accretion. But that's a good thing. That, Josie, that's a really good. I'm glad somebody asked that question. That's a good thing to look for.
I think we have time for one more. Yes. Okay. Cool. Max, we'll let you pick the last one.
This was one that I saw, kind of sticking with me. Based on your observations, do you think there's a big difference in like bycatch mortality with management, so with an intervention, versus without it? In other words, is there actually like an ecological, because both ways are bad in some respect for organisms, right?
Yeah, it's because one of the things we did was dive under some of these things, and you have the sargassum is actually like just sanding off corals and shading things and killing seagrass, and just it's causing abrasion of seagrass beds and killing everything, and or in the case where it builds up, it all the oxygen goes and everything dies and floats to the surface, and it's hard. I mean, it's damaging, which is why if we could keep it way offshore, that would be the best of all worlds. But yes, I think training people to look for the animals and is I mean, that's something I think can help minimize. And yes, I know we're saving a sargassum fish, and I know we're saving, a little lobster and this, and it's not, it doesn't make a huge difference because the damage it's causing to the environment's pretty hefty. But I think that's something that really needs to be studied, and that's something that we need to say, okay, because it is an essential fish habitat, and we need to say, okay, is there a point where fewer animals use it? Is that, do we collect after that point? Because one of the things I've always thought, the animals, a lot of them, like the little frogfish, it had no idea its home had ran aground. I mean, it's just, and it had nowhere to go. But no, I as much as I think observers are important. I think training people to try to minimize is the best we can do, is try to minimize. But that's something that needs more research, and maybe we can find the least impacting area to collect it. But that's going to take research. That's going to take study.
All right, thanks so much, Amy. We're actually at time. We got a lot of questions that came in. Thank you all so much for your participation and your questions. I did put our generic email here in the chat if you'd like to follow up, and we can forward your questions on to Amy from there.
I will answer them.
Oh, good. Okay, perfect. Yeah. So go ahead and send them to our SECART email. But yeah, Amy, thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation. We really appreciate you presenting on your work with us today. And make sure you get back to us with that number so we can tell our audience.
I will find out. Actually, I'm going to see if I can get the landfills to tell me. That's going to be the very best way to do it, because that way I'll get everybody's sargassum.
That's great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Please register for our last webinar. That's next week, and we'll see you then.
Have a great day, everybody.